From a narrative perspective, the secret to a satisfying fight scene is to have the conflict represent a bigger struggle in the story, and from a theatrical perspective, all the coolest fights gradually build to a breaking point. Basically, if things happen for no reason, or if the conflict doesn't escalate, then it's not going to be as cool as it could be. In video games, you see this in the form of behavior patterns, form changes, and boss phases. Your enemy might start with a few easy moves and then slowly add more difficult ones in as they get closer to death. Or maybe you can hit them in certain ways to stop them from using certain attacks. However, often I find that these ideas clash with what makes a fight interesting in a mechanical way. For example, the presentation behind Bloodborne's fight with Ludwig the Accursed is pretty freaking awesome. The screaming assortment of limbs and mouths full of eyeballs only really remembers its four-limbed human life halfway through the fight, and uses whatever semblance of sanity that provided as a kind of buff. Not only does this reinforce Bloodborne's motifs of sanity, insanity, beasthood, and humanity, but it also shows the correlation between this character development and Ludwig's strength. It's one of the best executions of a phase change in the whole medium. However, from a gameplay perspective, Ludwig is the personification of a boss phase done wrong. Beast mode is a tough 2 minutes of fast damage and concentration, but then you need to learn a whole new crazy moveset of projectiles and big damage wake-up punishes, all with depleted health. It can be really tough to get good at fighting Ludwig the Man because to even try you need to endure an entirely different boss. When you lose against the Man, you don't want to have to fight the Beast again, which will inevitably put you on tilt when you rush and mess up. In this situation, I feel like the fix would just be to split the bosses into 2 separate challenges. Once you beat Ludwig the Beast to checkmark, and you'd basically fight Ludwig the Man as a whole new boss. It's basically how Nashandra came in after the throne battle in DS2. Luckily, Bloodborne is a pretty good game, so we don't have to go very far to see an example of this same idea done right. Just up the way is the Lady Maria boss fight, which manages to teach the player about the hard phases early on. Normally a boss will only introduce new moves after their health bar has been depleted enough. That way the player has enough time to learn how each one looks and how to beat it. However, Maria starts with pretty much her entire moveset. It has some delayed hits and it's pretty tricky to dodge, but it doesn't do much damage until she reaches phases 2 and 3. The only real difference is the range and I guess the aggression. As long as you learn to counter the early stuff, you can counter the new stuff. I doubt anyone would really debate that Maria is the standout best boss of Bloodborne, and it's weird to see such a difference in design between the 2 bosses so close together. It definitely explains why so many Dark Souls 3 bosses have similar design. At low health, Dancer gets extra swings, Pontiff gets a stand, and the Watchers even have the same kind of fire trail effect. Though I suppose Ludwig also has a certain legacy with Osiris going beast mode, Nameless going man mode, and Gale even does the exact same sanity power-up deal. But I think most people agree that fights like Maria and Artorias are more fun, or at least less frustrating than fights like Aldrich and Fried. Some folk may defend the Ludwig-style bosses as a test of endurance, but that's not really how the Ludo narrative plays out. When a boss transforms into whatever superform, there's really only 2 ways things can go. Either you win and the fight comes across as them falling to their hubris for not taking you seriously, or you fight hard enough to convince them to try and then you just get blown up. A better example of a test of endurance would be a boss rush, where multiple bosses you've already beaten team up and battle you one after another, or even rush you all at once. Here you win because you were stronger than all the bad guys put together, rather than because your opponent underestimated you. An example of a game that manages to have its cake and eat it too in this respect would be Punch-Out, and as a result it has some of the better boss fights in gaming. The first half of the fights are all pretty easy, starting off with simple tells and climaxing with confusing flurries. But once you beat the game and every boss comes back for revenge, things escalate to delayed hits and mix-ups. This allows for consistency in each boss fight while still giving the boss that same character development power-up that Ludwig does so well. In the first fight with Piston Hondo, you can get a power-up by hitting him as he bows, but in the second fight he's fully aware that you're fully aware of his moveset. He'll fake you out by pretending to be open and then he goes for a counter. Except if you're aware that he's aware that you're aware of his weakness, you can counter his counter and get a power-up anyways. If a boss were to do that within the same encounter, it'd probably be considered cheap, like the game was lying to you. But since the game's taught you that your opponent has evolved, it manages to be misleading without being inconsistent. These types of behaviors, found all throughout Tile Defense mode, create fights with meaning to them. Did you beat your opponent through genuine skill, or were they just cocky and not trying hard enough? If you win this fight, it proves that despite your opponent's improvements, you're still the better boxer. To me, that's the difference between an actual climactic moment and a scene that just happens to be exciting because it feels obliged to do so. A climactic moment shouldn't just be intense, it needs to be the culmination of everything that came before it. That way, it not only cements itself as the pinnacle of the experience, but it also ties the game together, lending closure to everything you've done. The best bosses often have a fight or two before the final confrontation, or at least reuse certain attacks from older fights as callbacks. This is what makes a fight satisfying from a mechanical perspective. Just as the climax represents a bigger struggle in the narrative, it should also reflect the struggle of overcoming the challenges which the game puts you through. Not all games can manage to bring all these complicated ideas together at the same time, but the ones that do almost always become instant classics.